Hi, my name is Jen Michalski, and my favorite thing is abandoned sanatoriums and hospitals.
Welcome to the Finding Favorites podcast, where we explore your favorite things without using an algorithm. Here's your host, Leah Jones.
Hello and welcome back to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and it is Sunday of Labor Day weekend and also, Erev Rosh Hashanah Eve. This is a very long weekend for those of us who celebrate the Jewish holidays, as the evening of Labor Day is also Erev Rosh Hashanah, the start of the Jewish New Year. So, L'Shana Tova to everyone celebrating the Jewish New Year, and I hope everybody else has a good long weekend for Labor Day. It is beautiful weather up in Chicago this weekend. We have the windows open. We have a cat in every window enjoying the fresh air and being nosy neighbors. It's a lot of fun. This week was a big week on my breast cancer journey. You'll hear me say to Jen, I'm going to say maybe an hour before I interviewed Jim Michalski for this, I got the results of a lung biopsy that I'd had on Monday. So if my voice either seems raspy during the interview, it is because on Monday I had a lung biopsy and a lymph node biopsy that was through my windpipe. The results of that, thank God, are that the breast cancer has not spread. I am back to a diagnosis of stage 1A breast cancer, back to it being very textbook, very simple, or very straightforward to treat. And then I got surgery scheduled, and I went ahead and took some breathing room. They offered me, the first date that they offered me for my lumpectomy was on Yom Kippur. And I decided that Hashem and I had some things to talk about and that I would rather be in synagogue that day rather than on an operating table. So I have a lumpectomy coming up at the very end of September 27th, which gives me just time to reorganize my brain a little bit. And then in October, I'll have a breast reduction, which is not required for the treatment, but is the silver lining I'm forcing out of this situation. And then in November, I will start probably 3 months of chemo. Does mean that my February comedy plans are probably getting scuttled because I don't think I'll be healthy enough come the first week of February to go to Boston to see the Doughboys. So that's a bummer. If anybody wants solo tickets to Foxwood Casino or Boston, let me know. I'll have some tickets available. Such a bummer, but I would just rather have Yom Kippur to pray rather than push the deadline as fast as possible. And that's my world. I started a new podcast called Candy Chat Chicago with Jocelyn Gayboy. We talk every week about candy. We're spending a lot of time talking about Canadian candy, which is very funny. And wasn't our goal when we started the podcast, but that is fine. So I think that's what I've got for you this week. The good news that my breast cancer has not metastasized, that I just have some arthritis that I'm going to have to start managing a little differently, because that's what's showing up in my lungs and in my liver. But it's not additional cancer, and that is a relief. This week I've got author Jen Michalski. Jen and I can't quite place where we met, but we have been online friends for probably 12 plus years, and it was really nice to get on Zoom and talk to her. This week I also used a new audio plugin. We had some feedback reverb problems that kind of sounded like it's 2006 and somebody's put their BlackBerry too close to the phone in the office. We kind of had like a weird reverb effect, but my friend Dave Kustin, who was on talking about trumpets, helped me find a plugin called the Soothe 2 that helped fix our audio. So the audio is a a little wonky, but it's much better shape than the raw audio that we recorded. So enjoy this conversation with Jim Michalski. Pick up her new book, follow her on Twitter, and wear your mask, wash your hands. If you're available for the booster, get your booster. And if you know anybody who is eligible for the vaccine and hasn't gotten it yet, it's FDA approved now. So hopefully folks in your life are getting the vaccine as well. Enjoy those favorite things and Lashana Tova. Hello and welcome to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and this is the podcast where we learn about people's favorite things and get recommendations without using an algorithm. Today, I am excited. I'm excited every week. I'm especially excited when authors that I got to know at the Pilcrow Lit Fest are publishing new books and are back on the podcast. This week, I have Jen Michalski with me. She's joining me from California. She has a new book out on the market called You Will Be Fine, which has an adorable sloth meditating on the cover. We will get into it. Jen, how are you doing this evening?
Doing great, Leah. How are you?
I'm good. I just found out that I do not have metastatic breast cancer, so I'm very good tonight.
Oh, that's incredibly great news.
Yeah.
So good to hear.
It's just stage 1. And like 3 weeks ago, if I would have felt like that was good news, I wouldn't have understood, but I'm so relieved tonight.
I'm so happy to hear that.
Thank you. So we did meet at Pilcrow, right? At the Pilcrow Lit Festival in Chicago?
No, it must have been somewhere else, but that's okay because I was talking to someone last week and they were like, don't you remember we talked here? And I was like, we've just been to so many things, it's hard to remember where you talk to people.
Yeah.
So it's probably somewhere else.
Okay.
But, yeah.
I had you locked in my head as someone who came through Chicago for that festival, but there are so many ways to know people. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So when I was looking through your bio, a lot of your early bio is heavy Baltimore. Mm-hmm. When did you head out to California?
We moved here in the summer of 2019. So we've been here just about 2 years in July.
Okay.
So it was a big change. I grew up in Maryland and I went to college, both undergrad and graduate in Maryland. And I moved to Baltimore in the 90s after undergrad, thinking that was going to be a temporary stop. And then all of a sudden I was like, God, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here. And that wasn't so terrible. It didn't feel terrible. I built a really great circle of friends and community. And I don't know, my twin brother wound up moving to LA 3 years ago. And then our mom had just died, and then our aunt had died after that. And it just felt like all the family bonds that I had in the area were gone. And I know that family isn't always blood, but sometimes a place. I thought Baltimore was this magical place, and it still is. But I realized a lot of it was like knowing that you were sort of tethered there by other people that you cared about, and having all those connections severed made me think, well, maybe this is a good time to explore another city and see, if just be somewhere else and see how that things change for me or don't change. So we moved here in 2019. My partner got a transfer, her company. I work from home, so we just moved the computer from one place to another.
Yep.
And it's been a lot different, but every place has good and bad. And we're still just, and then COVID happened, so we're still it's kind of still new to us. We haven't really been out.
Yeah.
Like readings I know I'm in a writing group here, but we're mostly on Zoom, which is weird because 2 of us live like 10 minutes from each other. So it's still we're still like kind of integrating here. Hopefully there'll be something that happens soon.
It has made it such a hard time because my nephew's currently living with me. He graduated college in Idaho, moved to Chicago. and he's working, but like, I don't, it's so hard to meet people during COVID and build a new community.
Well, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to meet people as an adult too. I
Also
feel like
that.
I love the community in Baltimore, and I'm always like, oh, well, you don't have that here yet. You won't have what you had in Baltimore in terms of the writing community. I mean, I have to remind myself it really evolved over the course of like 10 years, and it
Right.
feels like it feels very complete all at once. But when I really think back, it took many years to meet all of those people and keep seeing them over and over and developing a relationship. And it feels very, like I said, complete now, but it didn't just spring out of the ground. So
Yeah.
it's going to take a while to do the same. That said, Baltimore has some really unique characteristics that made it conducive to having a great literary scene. There were several writing programs in colleges, really like Chicago, really densely populated around each other.
Yeah.
So you end up knowing a lot of people who taught classes at Hopkins or at Loyola or Goucher or University of Baltimore. So and they all knew each other because they would, maybe teach one class here and one class over there. So it was a small town. Everyone sort of was really friendly. It's sort of southern, but not.
Yeah.
Everyone else had a bit of a chip on our shoulders because, we're nestled between Washington, D.C. and like then Philly and New York on the other side. And we're just sort of like that little brother or sister that never gets any attention. So I think we kind of really close ranks and sort of really bond and promote each other in Baltimore
Yeah.
because like we're not New York or we're not, LA or whatever. So it was definitely it's still a really great scene, but you're right. I don't know how like COVID has really affected all these small literary ecosystems throughout the states.
I think it sounds like Baltimore probably does have a lot in common with Chicago in that way. It's because we definitely, I mean, Second City, it's truly a complex of we're not New York, we're not LA, we're the Second City. But because we've got Northwestern, we have our Loyola, Columbia, so that writers are able to piece together adjunct professorships and classes and everything combined with independent bookstores. It's made for a really vibrant scene.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think we have one of your transplants now. I think I remember hearing that Jemp went to University of San Diego. Is teaching there. The Zank author.
I don't know. Maybe
I'll have to look into that again and
yeah.
double check. Just interesting connections.
Yeah. Are you near San Diego?
This is actually, when I lived in Baltimore, we lived right in the city, so we were pretty close to everything. Here, we're not exactly in a suburb. We're in Carlsbad, so we're like an hour and a half south of LA and maybe like 25 minutes north of San Diego.
Ooh,
So
okay.
it's sort of like living in a suburb of Chicago where you'll go downtown for something, but you don't go every weekend like you did when you lived in the city. So, we might go to a bookstore once a month down there because there's not one here. We're not really Barnes and Noble. So it's different. It's more family oriented. We're right by the beach, so that's kind of fun. We can do things that we haven't been able to do. Like we tried surfing this summer, and neither of us died, which was great. We've done some kayaking in the ocean. It's a very moderate temperature, so you're just outdoors a lot. I mean, you're outdoors all year long, which is because like Baltimore, probably like Chicago, had really miserable winters. I mean, a lot of snow, really wet, really damp, and then in the summer it was always a lot of thunderstorms and just humid. So there was always a lot of water involved in the air in Baltimore, and it's a lot drier here because we're not far from the desert. There's like 4 different like climates you have to consider, and like the forecast will list them like inland, coastal, inland, mountain, desert, and they go really fast. And I always get confused, like which one is ours. And I'm like, it's going to be 105 tomorrow, but it's like for the desert, not for the coast. And I'm like that with time zones too now. Like I used to be when I was on the East Coast, I was like snap good at time zones, but now I'm on the West Coast. and I have to like calculate backwards or ahead for
Mm-hmm.
you 2 hours ahead. Like I just can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
I'll just call people randomly, and it's like, it's midnight here. Why are you calling? Is there an emergency? And I'm like, no, it's just 9 here.
Right. It's just now time to talk on the phone.
Right out here, it's just
Yeah.
cocktail hour here. So I think after 2 years I would figure that out, but I think this is going to be a handicap of mine.
Yeah.
Forever.
Well, it's better to accept it and just claim it and move on instead of like constantly trying to fix it.
Yeah, and there are just so many things you can look on your phone and like set, it'll automatically convert. It's just, you can be dumb about it, but I don't know. I'm not used to not having it in my head, and that's like terrifying. That loss of control as you get older, or like
Mm-hmm.
you just learn something new. I was telling my partner, like everything I've learned, like, and technologically I learned at my job like before I went freelance like 20 years ago, and I'm really good at that skill set. But my God, if I had to go into the office and you made me do like something, I'd probably be like my mom, and I just, who called Facebook like face page and didn't, just didn't know anything.
Yeah.
So, but it's tough, I don't know. Moving has sort of been sort of like that too, because you're just alone in a place and you have a lot of headspace. And I realized that a big coping mechanism for me in Baltimore was just to be busy all the time. I mean, I not concurrently, but one after the other, had a reading series. I co-hosted one for like 5 years and then ran my own for like 3. So that was almost like a decade of always, having a series and also running a literary journal since, I don't know, 2004 or 5,
Right.
So there was always something, and then just having the writing group, and then just having writers happy hours or doing this and that. There was always
Mm-hmm.
something that kept me busy, and I realized here now I have a lot more quiet space, and it's hard, like to really just slow down and think, well, where am I? What have I accomplished? What does it matter? And realizing that it really doesn't matter. It's like, I don't know, life is kind of like just a big game. If you really look at it that way, you just have to, you don't have to win it. And
Right.
you just have to sort of go through it. It's like that game life.
Yeah.
It's kind of, but it doesn't have to be anything. Like I just try not to worry as much as I used to about being successful or what that meant for me. Because you can
Mm-hmm.
find that too. What is successful for you? It's not what another author's experienced. And maybe early on you sort of used other authors as a gauge to see where you were, or you even used other authors just to try and figure out what your trajectory would be.
Right. What are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to want to do? Yeah.
Early on, like, 12 years ago, I just remember thinking, well, I want to be Laura Vandenberg. She had a book come out with the Zank. I had a book come out with the Zank. She won a Press 53 award. I won one. I just sort of submitted stories where she did, and you kind of latch on to somebody, and you study their like model of success.
Mm-hmm.
And then when your paths start to diverge, you take it personally. You wonder what's gone wrong, what went wrong,
Yeah.
and just learning to accept your own path. And I realize now that I'm really the happiest when I'm just writing, when I'm just in front of my laptop and I'm writing. I'm just thinking about the people in the book or the story. I'm not thinking about myself. And then, like, all the other stuff is just so stressful. Getting the book published and promoting the book and hoping people like it, all that is really stressful to me. So I try not to have any. I just try to really celebrate the part that I get to create this world of people and control them and work out like my own theories of life, because I always feel like I'm living wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to like use those characters to try and like figure out how to do it
Yeah.
right. So, or just game out theories like, well, what if something terrible did happen to this family, or what if my dad really isn't dead and he comes back and he's transitioned, or thing like that. So it's kind of like it's fun being a writer that way, and also just comforting because you get to think through like life problems.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. I do. I agree with you that the space that COVID made, for me, it was getting rid of 2 hours a day of commuting and that like constant forward motion of just life in the city of striving. And I had started to reach a place where I was like, I don't think I want an ambitious job anymore. I don't think I want a career. Like I did the striving corporate thing. And I want to find a place that is less about that reaching for the next like constantly trying to go up that path that of the hierarchy that the industry sets. And so I have really enjoyed the space of COVID. It sounds awful to say that, with all of the footnotes about that it's a bad experience and we wish it hadn't happened, right? But like I enjoyed the space and getting to breathe into it. And I never would have started a podcast if I hadn't gotten back 2 hours a day of my commute and then really finding out that I don't need to be out at a networking event or a show or a something every night. Like that I'm much more comfortable with my own company than I might have predicted.
I can't agree more. I mean, I remember I read an article recently about maybe half the people are trying to decide whether to go back to their jobs, whether to try something new. So I think it, I'm sure there, for all the negatives of COVID, it really sort of gave people a reset, like you said, on your life and their lives. Like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And I think it's been an overall positive thing that we don't need to think about, well, my immediate goal that I'm striving on is to get like a new car, or a new stereo system or something. I don't know. It just sort of reminds me of that Nick Hornby novel about a boy where the character has the father's royalties and he divvies up his day into 15-minute segments. And I feel like we sort of do that, but with goals to keep us keep us from staring into the abyss. Like, oh my God! Like if you think about it, it's just really there must be some like filter in your mind that keeps you from being absolutely horrified every day that you wake up and you're like, why am I here?
Yeah.
Whose idea was it to make human beings? And
yeah.
And what happens when we're gone? And I guess that was one of the other like things I thought about being one of my finding favorites. I love like paranormal stuff. I love, I'll be the one that's scrolling through all the Netflix or all the streaming stuff, looking through the really cheesy, like, ghost stories and found footage. My part of it, like, that is so fake. Can't you tell? Anyone can fix that. But it's something about, I don't have really, I was, raised Catholic, but I don't really have a religious leaning now. And I think concentrating on like ghosts and the paranormal and the beyond is sort of like, not a scientific religion, but maybe a less and sort of dispassionate one. Like, well, where does the matter of people go, and does it stay here? And is there an imprint? And do people? I don't know. I guess I'm interested in near-death experiences and paranormal, but it's also, I don't know. It's also something that embarrasses me a little bit to say, oh, I was in a ghost hunting group, or because
were you? Were you in a ghost hunting group?
We didn't really do a lot. And all I remember from it was there was a woman in our group who would she didn't like another guy in a group, and she kept calling him not trustable. And like I can't like ever say it's like ruined my vocabulary. Like when I want to say so and so is not trustworthy, without not trustable, and I look
not
like
trustable.
And now I just sort of leaned into it, and I like sort of use it as a joke, not trustable. Yeah. But that's the only thing I remember from our time in the ghost group. It was so long ago. But yeah, it's one of those things. I think that you run the danger. That's the danger of being really passionate about something, is you run the danger of being ridiculed. But we should all be beyond that. Like it doesn't matter, that I like to watch ghosts, or that I collected lots of bust interior things, back in the day. But that was definitely something I was thinking about also.
I think we're hitting a place in culture where the ridiculing people for liking something, the cynical disregard for passion. I think we're getting past that, and I feel like certainly in every one of my conversations I have with people, it's like the world is so hard. It's okay to love a thing, to love a pop culture thing, to love a hobby, we're going to talk about exploring with you, but there's just something really special about dropping the trying. It's such a hard lesson to learn, like to drop that judgment and just like the thing. For me, it sounds so cliche now, but it was Hamilton. Like, Hamilton was, my sister found it first, and then I got the Broadway cast recording, and I'm a single woman without kids, so I bought a very expensive ticket and went to New York and saw the original Broadway cast, and like that, like my hobby for 2 solid years was just being obsessed with Hamilton.
And well, that's amazing. I'm so glad you got to see the original run in New York. That's so cool.
It was really cool. And then I was like, oh, I suddenly understand sports. Like, now I understand having a football team because I'm tracking, like, who are all the Aaron Burrs right now, and who's going from a tour to Broadway, and who's going to a TV show. And I was tracking all these people, and I was like, aha, now I have a lens to understand other hobbies that I didn't have before. And it's just been nice to just lean in and like things.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, I think, a healthy balance, though, because I've noticed that it's definitely like, for some people, like an identity that it's filling a void in identity. Like, when you mention sports fans, I think about like politics now, and how that's sort of like being a Steelers or a Cowboys fan, and the other team absolutely hates the other, and it fills a void that then there can be no nuance. Like, whatever the Cowboys do, if you're a Steelers fan, is terrible, and vice versa. And whoever like was the genius that political like consultant that discovered this and turned us all and turned on our tribal switches is a genius for them, but it's just been terrible sort of for us, it's I don't know. So like anything, I guess it can be a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm definitely like you. I'm really happy that more people are standing up, because even like social media, for even now, really, for the past 10 years, it's just been so cynical. Like, everyone is just like pushing each other out of the way to make a meme about something, or be the first person to say something snarky, and it really just kills the spirit. And I think it's nice that people are pushing back and saying, well, it's okay for someone, if someone writes a shitty article on Slate, like bemoaning some sort of subculture, and for somebody in the comments to say, it's all right for people to like shit. What's wrong with that? Let them have it. Like, there's environmental disasters and a fucking pandemic, and people are dying, and there's large wealth inequity. Why can't they like, whatever it is that they like? But on the flip side, you don't want to like be exclusionary, because of your group, exclusionary to other people. So it's life is complicated.
So let's talk about the subject you landed on for tonight, which is near the world of paranormal. It might have some overlap. What is it that we're here to talk about?
We're here to talk about abandoned sanitoriums and hospitals. Hospitals they used to be called different things, but mostly state hospitals, asylums, training schools. I'm not sure where my interest first started. I know that I've always been interested, and maybe because or writers, but I've always been interested in the psychology of people. And I thought that was something I might major in college. And then I got there and like all the party people weren't in the psych major. It's really wrong reason, right? But I was like, oh, all the people who drink and have fun are in the arts. So I'm going to stick over there. Plus, like the citation system for like the APA just completely befuddles me. I hate it. I can't imagine spending the rest of my life citing articles like that.
So you went with the MLA?
Yeah, MLA is more streamlined. It's easier. Yeah. And now I work primarily with AMA. So, I'm not even like there. I've gone to a completely different place. But so I've always, I don't know, it's always been something. And, you have like all the urban legends in college. Yeah. And you hear it. I went to St. Mary's College of Maryland, and it was basically on this little peninsula on the river. And it was like the first place where settlers landed in Maryland and made their first colony. There was a huge slave population, so there was a lot. This is going more into like paranormal, that's spooky stuff. It was always interesting, and we on the East Coast, because I'm on the East Coast, we definitely have a higher proliferation of state hospitals. And I guess the funny thing is that I'm always into like found objects too. So I find like a toy on the ground, I will pick it up and take it home. And this is a danger. My grandfather would live through the Depression. He would always bring stuff home from his walks.
Yeah.
Whatever it was. Thinking, it's like that fine line between like being a hoarder but not. My grandmother.
You might have a use for it. You might.
Right.
You don't want to. You can stop it from going to the dumpster.
Right. Yeah. And it's something, I don't know. It's something about the story behind it. Like I'll find an abandoned head of like a Barbie doll, and it's like there's no use for that. But you'll still bring it home and wonder, well, who played with it? Why? Where's the rest of the body? What happened to it? I've always been into like just sort of picking up found objects, and a place that you can find a lot of it. It's interesting that a lot of asylums that just. Well, I want to go into some history too, because it's really interesting. But a lot of them were just sort of abandoned in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And by abandoned, I mean like everyone just sort of packed up what they needed and left, and like put a padlock on the door. And I like in Maryland, there were a couple of there's one that's in the county not far from me when I lived there. It's called the Rosewood Center. It's closed. It closed in 2009. But my ex-girlfriend, her mother worked there in the 60s, like during summers during college. So I always heard the stories. And, by the time I had got out of college, it was a huge campus. And it's kind of funny because, they sort of like are like college campuses, they sort of house a lot of people, there are activities. There's a fine line between the sanity part of it, but it sort of feels like home, when you just get out of college. But anyway, this place had it had been drastically downsized. So there were still like maybe 200 people there out of 3,000 in its heyday. And they were in the smaller, newer buildings. And they were just these huge sort of beautiful old buildings architecturally, and I love when like the weeds and the vines sort of crawl up the walls and he's into my whole haunted house thing too. But there is so the Rosewood Center in Owings Mills, Maryland. We went there, my girlfriend and one Saturday. We just had to there was like a very basic like patrol car that would go around once in a while. But we went there and broke into one of the buildings. There was another bunch of teenage boys that were there too. We all decided to combine forces and look around. And it was just amazing that everything was still there, like typewriters from the 70s and file cabinets and patient files, what a huge HIPAA violation, right? It's just like everything. No one cared. Like those people's lives weren't important enough that they didn't
have privacy.
Yeah, or it just like archive their files or do anything with them. It just left them there, and it was amazing. And they were like catacombs. The place was falling apart. I think back on it now, I'm like, all that stupid stuff you did when you were younger. But we would like go down the steps and there'd be stairs missing and be like, oh, let's just step over them, not thinking like, well, hey, maybe the whole thing will collapse or this
Right.
whole place is filled with asbestos, So we're just there were like these catacombs in the basement because a lot of these larger institutions had tunnels and things because of the winters and also to get people who passed away out. They didn't want people going through if they didn't have their own morgue, which some of these places did. They didn't want patients to see these people, especially for like the tuberculosis sanatoriums, because some of these state hospitals they doubled as TB hospitals too. So Rosewood was not the case, but they did have some tunnels. And I just remember going through a tunnel and shining my flashlight in some of the rooms below. They were almost like prison cells. And some of them had like beds in them. And I remember one of them had like that old like Fisher Price garage from the 70s on the floor. It occurred to me, my God, they're keeping like, children down here.
Right.
In these catacombs in the dark. And, someone played with that. And, there's always this sort of like, you want a souvenir, you want to take something home and like ponder it and wonder about the life of it. But then you're like, that's some seriously awful karma if you take something, from an abandoned state hospital, whether it's a suitcase or a toy or a shoe or something. So, but everything was still there. So the Rosewood, it opened in 1888. And, the interesting thing about it, considering the kind of people that we are today, how selfish we are and how we just sort of NIMBY, not in my backyard. We don't want to see homeless people. We don't want to see people who are differently, able in the mind. It's just amazing me. It amazes me that like in the 1800s, 19th century, we had these grand ideas, like we're going to rehabilitate people, and we're going to like even prisons, like the Quakers started the prison system in Pennsylvania. Like we're just going to let prisoners sit quietly and reflect upon their sins, and hopefully they'll work it out themselves. And sort of that's sort of what happened with these these state institutions too. The first treatments during the 19th century, and people were dealing with things we're dealing with now. They were dealing with epilepsy and dementia, Alzheimer's. But what happened, obviously before penicillin, people died fast. We'd probably both be dead by now 2 centuries ago, but now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's better care and antibiotics is really factored in. So people didn't worry about like little Jimmy, who was different, because he was probably going to die before he was 20. And there was no need to like, all of a sudden he's like outliving his parents. And it's like, well, who's going to take care of all these people that have always just sort of lived with their families and then their families are gone. So there was a lot of need for that. But these places, were really, in the beginning, the treatments were really just moral treatments. They were like, they wanted people to work. Most of the institutions were out in the country. They were sort of like these huge spas, things you pay like thousands of dollars for to stay. You'd go out there in the middle of nowhere and you'd have a view, and like, because there was great ventilation. They did this sort of like bat wing construction so that every wing had a view of the mountains or whatever was out there, and then they could get proper ventilation.
Because wasn't it always like TB especially was like, wasn't it a fresh air treatment? It was get the windows open, get fresh air in. I feel like there are always stories in like of European. I feel like Camus was like in a hospital, like up on a hill, taking on air at earlier in his life. You can just look at the pictures online of like people like in their hospital beds in the middle of winter on these huge outdoor porches at these sanatoriums just to get sunlight and air before antibiotics. That was really all they could think of. But these institutions, they had farms, and they were meant to be like self-sustaining, so people could work on the farms and they would harvest their own food. There were sort of workshops to try and train people. So, but then they discovered that people weren't like getting better. So, like the sort of the mindset changed in the late like 19th century during the Victorian time. They came, and the places started to become
more crowded because more people kept being admitted, but no one was leaving because no one was being cured. So these places got crowded really fast. And so they're just like, well, we need to have a different approach. So then all the terrible stuff started to happen. Like, like there were state laws in places like I think Connecticut where they, prohibited marriage for like people with epilepsy and people who they called feeble-minded.
Right.
Imbeciles. They started forced sterilization and eugenics, and then that didn't work either. So they had to the pendulum sort of swung back from like we're not preventing this next wave of population of people with mental health issues. So we have to try something else. We have to go back to prevention. But then the treatments got a little worse. They started to do electroshock therapy and put people on straitjackets. Oh yeah, insulin shock therapy. They would just like load people up on insulin and then bring them down and see what would happen. So finally, by the mid after World War II, I guess mid-century, like things like Thorazine had been discovered, and that was like, oh, all of a sudden we can manage people with schizophrenia, at least in a way that we can move people out of these places. And then during the Kennedy administration, Robert Kennedy's sister, Rose Kennedy, she had a bit of a behavioral problem, developmental disability. Her father made her have a lobotomy, and then like she was just like reduced to nothing. She just sort of languished away in one of these institutions. So a big part of like Kennedy's administration was promoting the Community Mental Health Act, which funded like group homes because he felt like his sister was doing better outside of an institution. So he wanted to get people out of these
and into smaller, like more home-like,
smaller group homes.
Yeah.
So as a result, from the 60s on, like the populations have been continually decreasing, but at the same time, there's still people there. They still need help, and all of a sudden, the funds are being reallocated to other places. So these places are literally just falling apart.
Yeah.
And at that time, then there was no incentive or no money to like demolish these places. So of course, people just left. The last person out, turn off the lights, and that was basically what happened. So, getting back to Rosewood, that's what happened to this place. They basically just didn't use the place, the buildings that were not in use, they fell into disrepair. And those were the places we sort of got to see.
How many times did you sneak into buildings there? Was it just the one time that you?
Just the one time, and we took a lot of pictures. Unfortunately, my ex has them, but there are other people who have gone in, and there are some really beautiful pictures online of the inside of these buildings. And they in 20, I think it was 20. I think it was last year. Some of the buildings caught fire. They suspected it was arson. So then they went ahead and razed a lot of the buildings. But there's a nearby university, Stevenson University, and they needed more land because colleges, unlike institutions, are always growing. So we need this land for our new dorms or what have you. So they bought the land, and now they're absorbing Rosewood into the grounds of Rosewood into their campus. But
they're choosing to build some very haunted residence halls is what they're about to do.
Exactly. And actually the place I'll talk about next has an interesting solution too, to repurposing the institution. But I will say, I did a little bit of research for Rosewood that just some things I hadn't known. And one of them was there was sort of I don't know how prevalent this was with other places, but like in the early 20th century, there were these wealthy families in Baltimore in the suburbs that would like adopt women from Rosewood, and they would, essentially use them as indentured servants.
Oof.
And they just would, a lot of them they worked really hard. They died of TB. They were treated poorly. They were sexually abused. There was one woman I read that had adopted like 35 Rosewood girls over the age, over the years. And then once they had no use for them, they would just kick them out. They wouldn't go back to Rosewood. So they'd not wind up, living on the street or turning to prostitution. I mean, it was really sad. Another thing that happened to Rosewood is obviously there's a large population of criminals who need more specialized care, and a lot of those patients came to Rosewood too. But they were just, and no one really taught staff how to take care of really insane people. So they didn't know what to do. And there was an incident where one of the residents was stabbed by another resident with a hunting knife that he had stolen from Target when they were out on a group outing, when they take a bunch of people out to buy some things. And they had security footage of the Rosewood employee in one aisle and then the resident in another aisle. So he was left on his own for a little while and was able to shoplift this knife and bring it back and kill someone. But there was no training. And I worked at a state hospital, which is still around. It's called the Holly Center. It's in Salisbury, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. And I worked there during one of the summers that I was in college. And I worked in the day area in a classroom with the teacher who was a teacher's aide. So I didn't actually. We did do hygiene and whatever their needs were during the day. We took care of, but we didn't. It's not like I took a class, a psychology class. The only class I actually received was in self-defense, like how to get out of a chokehold. And for my class, most of the residents were severely physically disabled, like they were in wheelchairs and they were blind, or they were in jerry chairs, and some of them just came in on their beds in stretchers because we worked with them in occupational therapy. But for other classrooms, it would have been more of an issue. Culturally, Rosewood, there was a movie recently, actually, in 2017, called The Institute, that starred James Franco, and that was loosely based on Rosewood, if anyone is interested in watching that. The reviews, not so great, but, I haven't watched it yet, but, it's definitely available on streaming, TV or something, so.
There's also some good articles. I'll link to them. I think I feel like it was NPR did, maybe Curious City, because there was a huge TB hospital in Chicago that had people staying in it into the 70s, I think. And people would talk about it was a melting pot or a salad bowl of Chicago because it was the TB hospital for the whole city. So and it was on the far north side, but people would be sent from the south side of Chicago, all different ages. I think these stories that I heard on the radio were more focused on the kids of the TB hospital than the adults who were staying there, and their memories of what it was like to grow up and spend a few years living on that campus.
Oh wow!
That's now like a beautiful Chicago park and park district buildings, and but yeah, it was a huge, massive sanitarium. So
yeah, I'm gonna have to look up that NPR story. That sounds interesting. I did visit one more hospital. This was during, my big phase. I think within a year my girlfriend had gone to Rosewood, and then for my birthday that year, she planned a trip to Danvers State Hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts.
That sounds familiar. Is that a famous one?
It is, and I actually learned about it by watching a movie called Session 13. It was like a horror movie where these guys are hired to clean up like asbestos in this abandoned institution. And they actually filmed the movie in the institution. So it's really creepy and frightening. And then I became obsessed. I'm like, I have to see this place if it's still around. And at the time, in like, I think 2002 it was. So my girlfriend, we planned this trip to Boston. It's outside of Boston. And, we drove up there in the rental car, and there's this huge, like, no trespassing sign, don't come here. And it's like, and it's like, it was just completely hidden away from the main road. So there was this sort of like road that sloped up into the woods, and then there was like nothing. Yeah. And I was like, you stay here. I'm going to go on foot. And this place, unlike Rosewood, was a lot more heavily patrolled. And I think I got like a couple hundred feet up the road, and a truck came and picked me up. And
I was and took you back to your car.
Like, yeah, did you read the sign? I'm like, yeah, but I played on their sympathy. It was like, my girlfriend's mother used to work at a similar place in Baltimore and Rosewood, and I heard about this place, and I'm just really interested in the history, and I wanted to see it. I didn't mean any harm. And while we were driving, we just came out of the woods onto like the campus of Danvers, and the original like building in Danvers is just huge. I mean, it had like 8 wings on each side, so it was like this, like that huge batwing design. It was actually inspired. H.P. Lovecraft's one of his stories. He used Danvers as inspiration for Arkham Asylum, and actually Batman, the Arkham Asylum. Joker was based on Danvers, so it's that huge Gothic place, and we just like drove up, and this huge building came into view, and I must have like audibly gasped or something. Mm-hmm. And he's like, he stopped the truck in the circle in the front, and he's like, one of the guys is like, get out, and I'm like, what? He's like, get out and take your picture. Mm-hmm. Don't tell anyone that we let you in here. So he let me take a bunch of pictures of the main building. This was like 2002, so it was still difficult at the time to like get photos on the internet unless you were a little more skilled. You didn't just upload them from your phone or whatever. Right. You had to scan them in, and and then upload them to your blogger or whatever. Mm-hmm. It was a little more difficult, and I didn't wind up doing anything with them, just had them. But yeah, that was really nice of them. But so Danvers Hospital, yeah, it was just this was actually a hospital that was for mental health and for TB. So there was a TB wing. Okay. In the 30s there. It was one of that whole Batwing structure. They call that the Kirkbride plan, because there's a psychiatrist, Thomas Kirkbride, who he believed that design with the fresh air was conducive to health. So there were like 73 hospitals between 1845 and 1910, mostly the northeastern states, that were built with this Kirkland design. If you go on Wikipedia, you can get a list of like all of the Kirkland plan hospitals and which ones are still open. There aren't many. There's still a handful. In fact, there's one in the DC area, and I'm trying to get my current girlfriend, to go visit it when we go back to Baltimore in October for a reading. Like, we should go down to this place and see if we can, break in there. But now I've announced my plans to the entire world, I guess.
We'll go and see it.
We're not going to do it. We're not going.
No.
So go looking for us. We're not there. So this place also, was supposed to be a patient-run farm. It was huge. It was really successful in the beginning. It was lauded. Boston loved it. And then, but by the 30s, like, the same thing happened. It was already like completely overcrowded. There were people like with beds in the hallways. People were sleeping like bed. It was just like, there was nothing. It was already overcrowded, and then they were building like these additions, and then Thorazine and group homes came along, and then they started moving everybody out. And like Rosewood, one day, forever, they tried to close it in the 70s. The joke apparently among the employees was, they're closing this place, and no one would believe them, because it, when it was originally supposed to close in the 70s, it didn't close until like the 90s or something.
Right.
So it's, like 20 years of like, I don't think so. But finally it did close, and they did gut it. Actually, a development company bought it, and they converted that main building. They chopped off like the most of the wings. Left the middle, the main administrative building in the middle, and they converted that into luxury condominiums. I kid you not. So a state hospital is now like luxury condominiums.
Yeah.
They're beautiful, and they run from like $2,000 to $4,000 a month. But I can't just sit there and think this place was the birthplace of the lobotomy, and I can't just sit there by the pool and sip my fruity drink and think, oh my god, this is where they perfected the lobotomy.
Right.
The building I'm living in, it's just so weird. Like
it's
the weird things that Americans have ideas about. I don't think they advertise that in their in the properties website. That,
I'm sure they do not.
A state institution for people with disabilities, but but it's just like everyone in Massachusetts, I think, kind of knows about this place. So unless you are from there, you're gonna know what you're getting into, I think. So, but yeah. So it's just, I don't know. It's just a weird thing in America that we just have all this, this abandonment, and I'm sure there are people who are just really dig on other things, like abandoned churches or abandoned barns or abandoned subways. And it's just, there are like these entire, series on streaming series about abandoning amusement parks. That's kind of cool too. It's just this sort of this, we have these like architectural ghosts, and it plays into that sort of paranormal for you because it's like a physical ghost that's still there that you can see, and it's just how it just says something about our society and how everything is sort of disposable, including not just the people but the places that we house them in.
Yeah. Because these buildings, I looked up Danvers while you were talking about it, it does look so much like the college I went to. It looks like a beautiful college campus. But yeah, there was a synagogue not too far from my synagogue in Chicago. That was there's a number of churches and more churches and synagogues in Chicago that are now condos. Right. That I think that's happening in a lot of major cities, is that houses of worship fall into disrepair. A developer buys them and doesn't tear them down, but finds a way to fill them with condos. Because for years, like, the annual community service in the Jewish community was like, we would try and just like help there was a small congregation of Russian Jews trying to worship in the space, but the ceiling was falling in and there were pigeons in and out and in such incredible disrepair. And it is fascinating how quickly, even in the middle of a city, a building can start to return to nature. Like it takes humans a lot to prevent nature from taking over the buildings. It's not a small. It's no small act to keep a roof up or to keep the water out.
Yeah, I appreciate like the repurposing. I know when I lived in Baltimore, there's a huge cannery down the street from me, and my grandmother actually worked there before I was born, and she lost like part of her finger because she got caught, in the machine. And they repurposed that building. They kept the husk of it, and they turned it into like offices. And there was like a nice fancy. There was a bookstore chain in Baltimore that went in there. And some nice restaurants, and there's also a mill area, a textile mill area in northern Baltimore, where a lot of those factories were made into like artist spaces. But again, also luxury living. It's just kind of interesting that we sort of repurpose this history, but then we bring in this sort of very modern, like disaffected disassociation, like it's only for people with money. And then, so we repurpose these places for like low income housing, or like, it's sort of giving people this false sense of history. Like, wouldn't it be cool to live in an old prison, something, but it doesn't really address like, well, what happened in that old prison, or what, what's the history of that old church? And of course, it's in a great location because people worshipped in a very central area in the city, in an attractive area, and it's just interesting how we treat, I guess, history, especially architectural history in America.
Yeah, it really is, and it's something that you just said there about one of the things that so Chicago's, not this mayor but the previous mayor, Rahm Emanuel, defunded a lot of the mental health organizations, closed 50 schools in Black communities, really did a lot to just sweep the knees out from underneath the city. And so without the mental health social safety net, their homeless population really started to climb because people weren't having access to social workers, prescriptions that you need to be able to keep yourself housed if that's where you're trying to go. And I remember a couple winters ago, a Sears closed in our neighborhood, and it was a mile away from an overpass on Lakeshore Drive where there was a homeless or an unhoused encampment. And it was just like, but here is a building that is empty. Like, not even the SROs have been converted into studio apartments that are now a studio that's $1,200 a month, and they were SROs. And just how we repurpose all of the land in Chicago for more and more luxury, and not, the wealth inequality that became so apparent during COVID, when the hotels were empty and the streets were not empty, and how the politicians or the leaders in our communities didn't have like the political will to get people into those hotels and figure it out later. It's institutionalizing everybody isn't the right idea either, but I really believe in a housing first policy. Like, if you can get people into safe spaces, get them housed, and then the other things in their life that need support, they can, you just have to check off the housing part first. And so there are things about those state hospitals that probably were good for their communities, and then they just, like, it seems like they took it almost too far out of their communities. Or,
well, I think they were also sort of, for a long time mismanaged, like people who had no business being in there. Like, and also maybe there wasn't a treatment and treatment involved. Like, someone with epilepsy wouldn't be going to a state-run institution now.
Right.
Someone with maybe an intractable schizophrenia that, posed a danger to other people, that person may need, like around the clock monitoring, and that person would be appropriate. But, I think that just anyone and everyone sort of went into these places, and now there are different levels of group homes where people with, say, a mental a developmental disability can work and have a job and have a life and have a community, but also have that just extra hand for doing some of the things that may have made it unable to them to live independently before, whether it's help with budgeting or bills, or doing some sort of light maintenance or something. So it's just evolved too. It's a hard question because even more so now, because everyone is just used to, or they want everything instantaneously to change. So that people are complaining obviously about the homeless or the houses in unhomed encampments in, say, LA or in San Francisco, but these have been problems that have plagued this state for years, and no one really has a solution. Everyone just wants them not to be there, and it's like, well, you're going to move them somewhere else, and then it's either going to be someone else's problem, and then those people are going to complain. So why not just try and do something long term and figure out what are the unique, it's not like they're a herd of cattle. They're human beings that each have unique needs. Let's figure out what they are, and try and fit them into the appropriate places. But no one has any, people don't even want to pay for like water pipe repair, or, we have, look at Flint, Michigan, or even here, like our infrastructure, our water lines need to be updated. And no one wants to pay the extra money every month that it would cost, what $1 or something. It's just, we're really short-sighted. And I don't know if that's just a problem of education, that we're not taught like cause and effect and how maintenance is important. But everyone just seems to want to, because everything's so disposable. If you have a problem with your phone, you get a new one, or or a computer, and then, but it's not that easy for the infrastructure, and it's not that easy for people either. It's just fascinating to me that, life can be hard for people who mostly have it together. So I'm always interested in sort of I've always been interested as a writer in alternative narratives, people with different realities, and how to see the world through their eyes. So I'm just always interested in there are so many experiences of just people, their realities. They're so varied and different.
Yeah.
And even just the product of having a stroke, even, or being delirious because you are sick. It's just really amazing to me that it's so, the ecosystem of like one's mind is so fragile. And I'm just really grateful to sort of like have it together, for the most part. And then it's okay. The days that I don't have it together, it's okay. It's okay to have that day.
Yeah. So Jen, I'm curious about your new book that is coming out. I'm curious about two things. One, I'm curious if there are any abandoned state hospitals in California, but I kind of think California is almost too young a state to have them.
There is like one, and I think it's outside of like San Jose, so it's a little far for me.
Yeah.
But you're right in that most of the construction of them happened in the late Victorian era. So most of them are on the east coast, or
other
like
side of the Mississippi.
West, and they're like, when you think of the famous ones, I guess you'll think of like Waverly Hills, and I don't know if that's in like Kentucky or Tennessee or somewhere in the middle America, but I think that's as far as it goes. So that's something that's been hard to, like, the architecture's a lot different out here. So it's more Spanish style, and everything's a little lower to the ground. There's there's been definite plan community. We're in a planned community, so there's more planned community requirements. Everyone wants to see the ocean, so there's nothing over like a couple floors high.
Right.
So I really miss that old sort of gothic-y look of being in a city, and I miss church bells. Like my neighbor has like one of those clocks that plays like church chimes every hour, and I just love that thing. I like try to be outside at the top of the hour, because it just reminds me of being like living close by, like down the street from a church, and always hearing, and just the diversity of like on our block in Baltimore City, there was literally an old synagogue that was closed, but it was being rehabilitated, and right next door there was like a Baptist ministry, and they're like right next to each other, like on the street. It's like, you don't get that out here, and it was like an old school organ sort of Baptist. Like they would, like the chorus would be practicing on a Thursday night for the Sunday. You could hear them playing and singing, on Thursdays.
I love
Sunday.
that.
And then, the Jewish community would come in and be rehabbing the synagogue, on certain days. And it was just, I don't know, it was just, but there's everyone here is a transplant, and there's a lot of different people here, but it's sort of more like you're coming to start over, and like you're embracing that great American, like,
yeah,
start over. And that's sort of what the West Coast is. If you need a clean start, you go to the
just
West
go
Coast
west. Yeah,
and you just start over. And I think that spirit is really reflected in our vistas and our architecture and our landscapes. It really does feel like you're not really anywhere where you were before.
Yeah.
If you're like a Star Trek fan, it's like going to Risa or something. It's just a lot of palm trees and hibiscus and cactus, and it's just a lot of, it's like a landscaper. If you're a landscaper, you will have a job, here, because there's always stuff. But yeah, I wrote You'll Be Fine in when I was back in Baltimore, and there aren't any state hospitals or institutions in it. Actually, I wrote it at a really sad time in my life. My mom had just passed away. This was like, I started it in 2014, and my mom had just passed away, and my brother and I were sort of going through her house to get rid of stuff, and
Yeah.
my brother used to live there too. And it feels like whenever you, no matter how successful you are in your life or the person that you mature into after you leave home, it seems like whenever you go home, you just sort of devolve into that person.
Mm-hmm.
You were growing up as a teenager, and how you got along with your brothers and sisters. And I just felt like my brother and I he claims to deny it, but I remember getting into some fights with him about stuff when we were there, and getting kind of big bickering. And I just remember that morose person, angry person I was in high school, living in a small town, being closeted, couldn't wait to graduate high school and go to college and meet people.
Yeah.
This was like late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't even like necessarily to meet people and come out, because no one came out then.
Right.
It was just to get out of a small town and out of my graduating class of 80 people, and like just meet people who knew who the fuck their replacements were.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of my goal, just to get out. And now as an adult, like I can go back there, and it's fine, because you're an adult, and like all that stuff's forgiven. No one cares.
Yeah.
High school, but like I just started writing this book about. The first draft was called Siblings, about a brother and sister whose mother does pass away, and they sort of have this situation, and it evolved over time, to include like a mysterious aunt who comes to help with everything, and she has this big family secret. And there were some things that happened to my brother and me that like we just sort of discovered as we were going through my mom's things. We found this like manila envelope in like a big black Sharpie she'd written, "In the event of my death, destroy," capital letters. And we're just like, oh, I wonder what seem to be photos could be, and we're just like, well, should we open it and then we like cannot unsee that, whatever it is, or should we just, I think at the time we wanted giving them to my aunt, her sister, who has since passed away. So I have no idea like what happened to the photos, but I'm pretty sure they were things that I didn't probably want to see.
Yeah.
But so stuff kind of like that kind of made it into the book. And I don't know, I know when I set out writing it, because some of my first novel, The Tide King, and then The Summer She Is Underwater, they both had a heavy dose of like magical realism in them, and they were serious. And I was always a short story writer, and I discovered, like, when I was like hosting reading series or just doing readings, like sometimes people would come up to me after we'd be talking, and they'd be like, you're really funny in person. And it was like puzzling to me. I'm like, well, of course I'm funny. Why wouldn't I be?
Right.
Because I always see myself as someone who's funny, and I like to laugh, and I just have a light-hearted sense of myself. And the more I thought about it, I was like, well, gosh, if you read my book, if you only read my books and didn't really know me that well, you probably would think I was pretty morose.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew, like, at the time, I wanted to write something a little fun. I mean, there's still some heavy stuff, and You'll Be Fine, but I wanted to write something that was funnier, because I wanted it to be more balanced, and I wanted to reflect more of like my sensibilities. I wanted to write something kind of light and funny, and see if I could do it first off. And I just wanted to like entertain people and not feel like they had to read this, this depressing, heavy book. Like I went, not exactly like a beach read, but just something, I just want to do something a little different. So that was definitely something that, I set out to actively do. Like I said, I couldn't help but throw some heavier, depressing stuff in there because I just can't get away from that. But I really liked it, and it taught me that a book doesn't have to be all happy or all sad. It should really be both. I mean, because life is like that, and books should have moments of levity and also moments of weight.
Yeah,
and have to. So I think, and I was telling another writer recently. I'm like, it embarrasses me that it's taken me this long to realize that it's possible and you should do it. But you always can, you're always learning, and you always should learn something new. So
that's great. So You'll Be Fine is it available now, or is it about to be published?
it just came out this month, so it's available, and yeah, it's out. So definitely, if you're interested, pick it up, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody on the internets about it. I'm happy with it, and I think that was my really only measuring stick this time. I know we talked earlier about like success and what people's idea of success is, and who we emulate, if we think we're in the right area. There was definitely a time, right around when my first novel was published, The Tide King, that I definitely felt like, well, I'm moving up the mountain, writer. And I definitely feel like at this point, as a writer in this book coming out, like I'm not even sure I'm on the same mountain that I was on before. Yeah, and I'm not sure if I fell off or if I just jumped over somewhere, but I just, I'm someone who, in an industry where it's very much about building a brand. Like I've always been really undisciplined, and I just write about what interests me. So, I'll write like a literary fiction book with magical realism, and I'll write a book that is the first person of a developmentally disabled person, and then I'll write a book about a man who becomes pregnant, and then I'll write a book about that's more of an LGBTQ read. So, and I was working on like a graphic novel before that, and I finished writing a YA book, and I have a hard time like staying in my lane, I guess. So it's just been difficult to even have like a, Jen Michalski is known for this, as a mystery writer,
Right.
I don't really know what I am. And I think that's, that sort of lends into like this finding favorites. And that's why it was so hard to find like something that I was really passionate about. Cause I just pretty much like everything, and I'll do anything. Like I'm like, our philosophy in this house is you only live once, YOLO, but with SPF 50, because we're getting old and we don't want
we don't want skin cancer.
We'll do anything once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Jen, where can people find you online?
Mostly I'm on Twitter at Michalski Jen. And I'm still the editor-in-chief of JMWW Journal. We're a weekly online journal, so we're publishing flash and fiction and creative nonfiction, poetry. We also do interviews. Actually, one of our essays was just listed as a notable story in the Best American Essays that's coming out in 2022. Wow. So that was, we were really happy for that writer, and we always nominate for all of the awards, and we're really supportive of our writers and want them to do well. It's just a great love of mine. I've been doing it for a long time. I love meeting new writers through the journal, and I used to love meeting them through the reading series. Everyone has such a different journey of how their books came about or how their stories came about. So I love that you're doing this podcast, because it's something that you may talk about like at the bar after reading or whatever. Like, well, I didn't know you liked Power Rangers. I do too. Kind of thing. So I think where did you come up with the idea?
So when Mark Maron's partner passed away last year, Lynn Shelton, I found myself kind of having an outsized reaction because like I have this parasocial relationship with Mark Maron because I listened to his podcast. And I started exploring the idea of parasocial relationships with podcasters. And then I drew a mind map that was like from West Wing Weekly, I got to Gilmore Guys. And from Gilmore Guys, I got to How Did This Get Made? And then I got to the Doughboys, and then Nicole Byer, and then Mark Maron's over here, and Jason Mantzoukas is over here. And I drew a map of like how my podcast listening came to be. And I showed that, I posted on Twitter, and a college friend responded with a map of how his comedy sensibility came from Best Week Ever. And then I was like, oh, people have stories of like how they got a hobby or how they came to love something. And we usually don't get to talk about the thing we really like or that we're hyper fixated on. Like people are like, wrap it up, tell me like the 2 things about it.
Right.
People can be really dismissive when you're really pumped about your hobby. And I decided that was like everybody has something that they like.
Yeah.
So that's where it came from. And I've talked to people about music, TV. We were talking about Jen Uselis, who performs in Klingon. And it's really Kevin Smokler who was on last week about collecting used vinyl records. And
yeah, I like that one too.
So sometimes it's things like he got so into it that he did a documentary about it. And other people, it's something they would never, like I did an episode with Kedra Chaney about K-pop Dollstagram, which are like,
I remember I saw that one. I haven't listened to it yet. Yeah.
So that's around the fan culture of K-pop bands, but specifically the people that make plushie dolls and do group orders and distribute them among fans, like completely outside of the ecosystem of K-pop, of like the machine of K-pop. And I just love, I'm curious. I want to hear people, like, I want to hear the stories. And we don't, we get asked about our careers and we get asked our love stories, but people don't always ask us about the rest of our stuff. So that's what I'm doing.
I love it. That's a great idea. And aside on the K-pop dolls, there's I know people are really into the Funko dolls now, or there's just a huge empire or industry about them. But in LA, there's a Funko museum, and there's like on the site you can like make your own Funko doll of yourself. Like they'll just give you like hundreds of hairstyles and eyes and glasses and clothes, and you pick it all out, and then they make it for you on site.
It's like Build-A-Bear, but of yourself, but a Funko.
Yeah, my brother built to one of me. He was actually getting his like brakes done or something because there's like a garage. Yeah, LA is architecturally LA is a little crazy. So right next to the Funko Museum there was like a auto garage. He was getting his brakes done, so he was bored and he went over there to the museum and went through it, and then he got like little Funko dolls made of my girlfriend out of me for like our birthdays. So that was, they actually do kind of look like us. So
that's awesome. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, Jen, this has been fantastic. This is super fun.
Yeah, I'm so glad we got to talk about all this stuff. It was really great to talk about it.
Yeah.
But you can edit that out. I don't know what I was trying to say. That balloon just sort of flew around the room, and
I'll land it.
Thank you for listening to Finding Favorites with Leah Jones. Please make sure to subscribe and drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Now, go out and enjoy your favorite things.